realistically we'll go for 40, and then we'll try to open up the Q&A, and I hope we'll have a good, engaging discussion. Feel free to keep those questions coming. The topic for tonight is being religiously responsive to Australian Muslim learners. Are there limits? I'd like to start by positioning this within the Australian context of teaching and learning standards that have been set by AITSL. And one of the standards, 1.3, emphasizes that it's a need for us as educators to be responsive to learning strengths and needs of students from diverse linguistic, cultural, religious, and socioeconomic backgrounds. So it's very important to couch this talk in the fact that this is a mandate for us as educators in terms of best practice to be responsive to the diverse student body that we have in front of us. So based on that, I'd like to start with the publication. And that publication is something that colleagues of ours at UniSA have been working on, and their statement has been that Australian learners are super diverse. That we're living in a context today in Australia, in Canada, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, where we have classrooms that are super diverse. And I would like to extend that by saying if we have classrooms that are super diverse, then learner diversity is super complex. So if we can acknowledge the fact that we have learners that are super diverse, coming from different cultures and backgrounds and ethnicities and languages and so on, that to complicate this is to say that super diversity is super complex. And that's kind of where I'm going to go with the rest of this talk, is this super complexity. And to extend the idea of super diversity and super complexity is to say that Australian Muslims, I would like to posit, to argue, that Australian Muslims epitomize both the super diversity and the super complexity as a case example. And that if we can provide a model, an approach to supporting the complexity, the diversity and the complexity of Australian Muslim learners, that can then be effectively used with all Australian learners. And that's the sort of the basis upon which this talk is shaped. So allow me to delve into, first off, super diversity. I think it's an easy statement, and it's probably something that everyone would agree with, but I'd like to unpack it a little bit. When I say that the line that all Muslims are not the same, sounds obvious. But oftentimes when we're educators in classrooms, when we look at a diverse classroom, we may begin to make assumptions that if you're from a particular background, and I've had a student from this particular background in the past, I could then make assumptions about the student in front of me. But if we go with the idea that all Muslim learners are not the same, and we apply that to all students, we could then begin to unpack what these diversities might look like. And I'll give you the example of Muslim learners. So I would like to posit that Muslim learners are diverse in 4 different ways, and I'm sure in other ways as well, but culturally, they're diverse, theologically, they're diverse, generationally, and orientationally. And what I mean by that is culturally, we know that Australian Muslims are the most heterogeneous community we have in Australia, coming from over 183 countries. So culturally, we have a range of different cultures that comprise the Muslim community. We call it one Muslim community. Theologically, we know most commonly we have the Sunni and the Shia, 2 larger sects that define the community, the Muslim community in general. But within the Sunni and the Shia, there's many sub-sects or denominations or groups or communities. And some of them, like the Ismaili, the Druze, the Ahmadi, the Ibadi, and there's many, many others, we'll come across them in our schools. And we might have some of these communities within suburbs in Australia, in South Australia in particular, but everywhere, where you'll have certain communities that are grouping themselves together. So yes, they're Sunni, or yes, they're Shia, but within that there's also distinctions. And distinctions theologically in terms of their belief and practice. Generationally is also, I think, very important. And the reason why generation is important is because Australian Muslims, and I'm from Canada, but I don't think I've seen a history of Muslims in a migration context as long as I've seen in Australia. The waves of migration in Australia, I think, are very unique because it began with the Macassan traders in the 1800s. So we had a first wave of Muslims that came here. And then you had workers that came as the Afghan Cavaliers in the late 1800s. And then you had waves of immigration that came since the 1970s. Everyone from the Lebanese community to other communities that came after. And then you've had waves of refugees that have come as well from Muslim majority countries. So you've had a number of different waves of migration that create a very different experience for when we call somebody an Australian Muslim. I didn't realize this, but when I first came here, I realized that there was people who were I ran into young Muslims in Sydney that are third, fourth generation, never been to Lebanon, born in Australia, their parents are born in Australia, their parents' parents are born in Australia, so they see themselves as indigenous Australians. Indigenous not in the sense of indigenous Aboriginal, but indigenous in the sense of being born in this land. So different ways of migration also lead to different experiences. Obviously, if you're somebody who migrated here or came as a refugee a few years ago versus somebody who's been here for a few generations, your experience and your communication, your interaction, your engagement with the social fabric will be very different. 40% of Muslims in Australia are born here, which is an important statistic, and that there's an increasing population of Muslim learners in state schools, one of the largest increases in terms of a cultural or in terms of a cultural group in our schools. And orientation I think is one that we often don't speak about. But I think for those of us that associate ourselves as Muslims would agree that outside of theology, within a sect, within a community, there are different ways of looking at issues and your religious practice. In Jewish and Christian communities, I think this is more laid out. You have churches and you have synagogues that are based on different denominations and orientations. Amongst Muslims, this isn't as pronounced, but it's becoming more pronounced as this community begins to grow, as the Muslim community begins to grow. And Tariq Ramadan wrote an article that spoke about his spectrum of interpretation. Orientations have to do with interpretation of the classical Quranic text or the Hadith, and how you interpret that. And I'll give you an example as we move forward, but take the example of music. Learners in our classroom will come to our classroom, they'll all be Sunni, let's say. And they'll all be, let's say, practicing, observant Sunnis, let's say. But their interpretation of what's allowed in terms of music could be very different. Some of them might say we come from families that allow for the use of musical instruments. Some might say particular types of musical instruments. Some might say no music. So for us as educators in classrooms, we might assume that we're trying to support our Muslim learners in our classroom, but we can't assume that every Muslim learner will have the same type of belief when it comes to their interpretation of the faith. So Tariq Ramadan speaks about literalists, traditionalists, reformists, rationalists, and mystics. And he goes into depth into each one of those. But suffice it to say at this point that there are, outside of sectarian differences, there are orientational differences that make an impact and have an implication for how we engage with learners in the classroom. So I think what this does is it challenges some of our stereotypes. And what I mean by that is that the common perceptions that we have of not just Muslim communities, but most communities, is that they're a monolithic community, that they're predominantly new arrivals, or that they follow backward or outdated cultural practices, that they wish to impose these practices on others, and that their religious beliefs may be incompatible with the democracy and the Western values in the context in which they live. So looking at these different diversities and looking at these different ways of the diversities within communities helps us begin to unpack the fact that these stereotypes can then be challenged. I'd like to now move to super complexity. So I've gone from super diversity, and hopefully we established that, and I'd like to link this to super complexity. And I'll start with an example I like often, and it goes back to the example of music. So most of you are probably very familiar with a very well-known, world-renowned musician, Cat Stevens. And I use Cat Stevens' example out of love, but I think it's a good example for us to reflect on. One, because most of us can understand. We know Cat Stevens. We listen to his music. He had a real impact on the popular culture of our age. So Cat Stevens in the 1970s was probably one of the more well-known global musicians. British songwriter, singer, who then converted to Islam in the late 1970s, 1977 to be exact. And when he converted to Islam, he shed all of his musical career. He stopped singing, he sold his guitars, he auctioned off all of his records, he literally shed his musical identity. Because in his mind at that time, what influenced him was a very conservative interpretation of what's permissible in terms of music. So he started dressing differently, and he started to give lectures across the world, technically, speaking about Islam, speaking about perspectives on Islam, and started to almost become like a religious figure, religious scholar in the Western Muslim community. In the 1990s, something came over him, and he said to himself, I need to go back to my musical inclination, because that's part of who I am. And he found a way of interpreting Islam that said music is permissible, but only certain types of music. So he began to sing children's songs, nasheeds, songs about Islam, about being Muslim, in a way that had a good meaning and a good message, no musical instruments, and started to put out albums for young children and families. And most recently, you may know, because he came to Adelaide last year, and he had his Australian tour, he's now started touring again, putting out music again, with good meaning, as has always been the case, and something that he feels strongly towards. But uniquely, if you notice, he's picked up the guitar again as well. Still very Muslim, still very observant. And the reason I show this is because I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that in all of these cases, since he became Muslim, he's always been Muslim. But how he's interpreted his living or his observance of Islam has varied. And that's not something for us as educators to, it's not for us as educators to determine for the student, for the learner. It's for the learner to define themselves. And in the case of Yusuf Islam, Cat Stevens, it's been a process of defining where he sits and how he defines his practice of Islam. What I mean by this is that religiosity is fluid. So when we think about being religiously responsive to our students, to our learners, is to acknowledge that religiosity is fluid. To say that we cannot essentialize what it means to be Muslim. Why? Because not all Muslims are practicing or religious. Not all Muslims are practicing or religious in the same way. Not all who are religious have the same level of religiosity. So it's very common, for example, for us in schools to create a prayer space. You establish a prayer space because you have a group of students that have asked for a prayer space. But then, the students who ask for the prayer space don't go. Is it our responsibility to force them to go pray? Is it our right to remove the prayer space? No, because we created the prayer space for them to go if they like. That's their right. It's part of our sense of justice in education, is creating the opportunity if they've asked for it. But not all of them will have the same level of religiosity all the time. Not all Muslims hold religion as a predominantly identity attribute, which is also important. Oftentimes you might have learners in your classroom that come into your school and you see their parents, and you assume by the way their parents are being observant of Islam, because it's outward, let's say, you assume that the child is also an observant Muslim. It may not be. They might be one day, they might not be the other day, and that's also okay. Some are more secular in their outlook, some associate more with culture than religion, which is also very important. A lot of times you might come from a Muslim majority country, but you may not be an observant Muslim, which is also possible. Some might introduce themselves like, I'm Pakistani, Canadian. I could introduce myself in multiple ways. I'm a Canadian Muslim, Pakistani. I'm a Pakistani, Canadian, Muslim. I'm a Pakistani, Canadian. I'm a Canadian, Pakistani, I'm Canadian. I'm a Pakistani. I could go multiple ways, right? So if somebody asks me, where are you from? What would I say? Well, I could say I'm Canadian. But no, where are you really from? Well, I'm Canadian, Pakistani. Okay. Maybe I didn't have to say that I'm also Muslim. Maybe I begin with I'm Muslim. What's more important to me? And the important thing there is to let students define themselves. Because each student might see a different aspect of their identity as more important or non-important. So I may not reveal the fact that I'm Pakistani. I may not reveal the fact that I'm Muslim. And you get the idea. The second aspect of the complexity of Muslim learners is that the socio-political context that we live in has real implications for learners. And what I mean by that is quite clearly 9/11 and everything that's happened post 9/11 has had a real impact on Muslim learners in the classrooms. Some have said that we feel like we're being framed as suspect citizens everywhere we go. In another study, they talk about 9/11 and everything post 9/11. These are Australian students, by the way, who said that it's led them to a re-examination of their faith. For some students, that re-examination of their faith has led them to remove visible aspects that identify them as Muslim. And for others, it's encouraged them to put on visible aspects that show that they're Muslim. So it's had both effects. And just over half the participants that described September 11th as a formative experience which led them to engage more deeply and critically with the religion. Some students post 9/11 have started to ask more questions, more deeper questions about their faith. Do we really believe this? Where did this come from? Can we justify this? And others have begun to believe in a more firm manner, being able to search and educate themselves about the religion and feel more strongly toward it. But it's had real implications. And I think the other aspect is to recognize that Islamophobia itself is real and it's continuing. And it's a cycle of discrimination that is being perpetuated constantly. We've seen that after one other study that happened here in Australia showed that after every incident of terrorism that's happened, there's been a spike in Islamophobic incidents. Here in Australia, and in the United States, and in Canada, and everywhere else, there's a spike. 79% of Australian Muslims feel that the media portrays Islam and Muslims unfairly. That's a pretty significant amount of people that feel they're being inappropriately or misappropriately treated or framed. And 70% of Australians who do not identify as Muslim acknowledge that they know little or nothing about Islam and Muslims. So that also connects to the fact that although the media is portraying them unfairly, or they feel the media is portraying them unfairly, that the majority of people out there may not know. And that's where cultural understanding comes in. Is when it comes to our classroom learners, it's about creating that space to understand who our learners are. Not just Muslim learners, all learners, but like I said at the very beginning, this provides us a case study of being able to look at Muslim learners and how we apply that to others. The third aspect of complexity, I think that's important, is the need to move beyond accommodations and celebrations. I think the way that we've been thinking about supporting diverse learners for the past few decades in schools and in education has been to celebrate or to accommodate, to create a space for them to pray, for us to allow for there to be a multicultural day for them to express themselves. But that shies away from the realities that learners face, the realities of discrimination, the realities, the political realities, the social realities that students face, and the lived experience that students have endured. So part of this, I think, is also to acknowledge that being responsive is not about teaching religion. And I don't think I can emphasize that enough. That when we're talking about being responsive, religiously responsive, we're not teaching religion. And I make a little distinction here, that there's a difference between education of Muslims, like for those students that go to a madrasa, traditional school, or Islamic school, or weekend school or homeschool. Education for Muslims, creating learning materials and resources. Education about Islam, like in a world religions class, where you teach about a religious faith. What we're really speaking about is education through learner life worlds. It's really, like I mentioned earlier, it's about letting students define themselves and learning about their life world and their interpretation of their practice through their words and through their expressions, if they decide to express themselves, which is also a challenge, because not all students, like I said, would necessarily identify their faith or would want to identify themselves as being religious. So education through learner life worlds is really the emphasis that we're speaking about. I'd like to quickly speak about the discursive shifts as well. And I think these are overlapping. So I initially put years on these, and then I realized that this is sort of an ongoing discursive interplay. And what I mean by this, for those of us that are in the field of education, especially in academia, we know that we've had different types of conversations over the past 30 years, 40 years. Since as early as the 1980s, we've been speaking about exemptions and accommodating equal rights. So if students do not want to attend a class because of your religious beliefs, your parents say, I don't want my child playing a trumpet, take them out of music class. That's an exemption. So we give them their right. I don't want my child learning about sex education, exempt them from sex education. We moved from there to talking about multiculturalism. In the 80s and then in the 90s, we started talking about, well, how do we begin to create a sense of community? And we said, well, let's start to celebrate diversity. So in the 80s and 90s, you may remember there was a lot of conversation about celebration. We had multicultural days. We had what a lot of academics have written about as the dress, dance, and diet approach, which is let's celebrate the different types of traditional dress that people wear, the traditional foods that they have, and the traditional dance or music that they use. And that was a celebration, but as I said, very limited in its scope in terms of it's just focusing on aspects of cultural identity that, one, we assume all of them have, but they're somehow monolithic. So all Pakistanis have the same sort of cultural tradition, and at the same time, avoiding the actual realities of the students themselves. We then moved to the conversation around equity and inclusion. And we started talking about the word equity as opposed to equality. And the term equity and inclusion has become much more commonplace, I think, in teacher education programs and in schools. Talking about how do we begin to support students and be inclusive of their perspective across the curriculum, but also bringing different perspectives of their own life worlds into the curriculum. And that, I think, in Australia, that's played out a lot with school uniforms, saying it's not about exempting students, but how do we include students? So if girls, for example, say that I need to wear a religious attire that is accustomed to my religious beliefs, I still want to play soccer though. I still want to play rugby. So I just want to wear clothes that I can wear. And that's where the accommodation, or not the accommodation, but the inclusive practices come in, of allowing them to still be included, but on their own terms. And as of late, in the more so into the 2000s, we've been talking about the idea of culturally responsive pedagogy and social justice in education. And I refer to that as self-expressions of identity. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar, but there's a lot of young Muslims all over that have started to express themselves through poetry and spoken word. And when you listen to this type of art forms, you begin to realize that their lives, the richness of the complexities and the richness of their lives are coming out through the poetry, through the spoken word, which we would have never captured had we made assumptions that what they need is simply inclusion, or simply multiculturalism, or simply equal rights. Very quickly, I'd like to share some of the voices of young Muslims in Australia, and I have a study from the US as well, that have shared their perspective on being responsive in schools. One student began by saying, it was because of the reaction that I got in the aftermath of 9/11. Because I was from Pakistan, and people think, oh my God, there's Taliban, there's stuff like that. But that's what really made me strong. And I said, what? You know what? This is me, and if you're gonna hate me for who, I don't really care. I started wearing the hijab, in high school in year 7. So for some students, this level of Islamophobia has inspired them and made them stronger, made them feel a stronger sense of bringing their religious identity out. Others have felt in a different way. They felt like everyone was against me, and it took a toll on them. One student said, when September 11 happened, I was being called a terrorist. I was in year 11 or 12. What do I know about terrorism? I wasn't even praying at the time because I still didn't know much about my religion, and it was so hard. I got into fights. I actually failed grade 4 because of it. It was such a distraction, and I felt everyone was against me. It's students like these that we begin to recognize that when we give them the opportunity to share what's going on in their minds, we realize that the socio-political climate that we live in has a major impact on the lives and experiences of our learners. Another student said, we're just normal teenagers, and what we want people to understand is that we're just normal. She said, we're really not that different than any others, you know. I mean, we do have a different culture and stuff, but then we're all Americans. We go to public school, or if we don't, we still live here, and we have friends, we go to the mall, you know. It's not like we're some different species. We're just normal teenagers. And I think that's another aspect that a lot of young people want to get across to us as educators, is to recognize that I'd also like to be treated just like I'm a normal kid. I've got aspirations, and I've got challenges, and I've got feelings, and I've got emotions, and that's who I am, but I'm living within this context. One student spoke about prayer, and spoke about the challenge that they have in trying to get a prayer space. He said, I think it's kind of hard to pray. You know, like, teachers won't be like, yeah, go to the prayer room right now. No, they won't do nothing like that. If you ask the teacher, can I go to the prayer room? They'll be like, we don't have a room. And I'll be like, why? You know, we're Muslims, we need a prayer room, we need to pray. And they'll just be like, you're not in India, or something like that. So the response that some students have felt is that they have educators who may not fully understand their needs and be responsive to the needs that they have. And I think this is the last one that says, we can show others we are not a bad religion, and for some it's inspired them. And they said, like in my English class, my English teacher was talking about women, and he was like, and all know that Islam oppresses women or doesn't respect women. And I was like, no, it's the culture and not the religion. And he was giving examples of Saudi Arabia and stuff. It's really hard to confront a teacher when he's like a real respected teacher. So another challenge that the study showed is that students find it difficult to challenge discriminatory perspectives that are shared in the classroom because of the power dynamic, because of the privilege, obviously, that teachers have. But these are some of the sentiments I think that students have shown, that students have expressed as being important to the way that they think about their religion and the practice of their religion. I'd like to close with a few considerations for teaching and learning. I think in terms of pedagogical considerations, I think it's important for us to consider the fact that we're learning with and from our learners. That part of where we're going with this is to acknowledge the fact that we ourselves as educators are learners. And when it comes to being supportive of the diversity and the complexity that diversity brings, it's about opening ourselves up to being thrown off, to not knowing, and not making assumptions necessarily. Just because you have a Muslim learner who walks into your classroom wearing a hijab does not mean that that learner carries the same set of beliefs as the previous student that you had who wore a hijab. Example, like these are types of examples where we begin to say, how do we learn about this individual student's ways of knowing as opposed to making assumptions? Learners bring their own expert knowledge to the classroom. I think that's also very important to acknowledge the fact that not all learners will be as connected to the socio-political challenges that are out there, or the cultural background that we assume they might know about, or the religious beliefs and tenets that we think that they might know about. So we have to allow students to, again, express where they're coming from and allow them to bring the expert knowledge that they bring to our classrooms. Engage learners as researchers. I think it's about creating spaces. It's about creating spaces for students to also be researchers of things that matter to them. Things that matter to them because their life worlds are what they want to study. So if there's assignments or assessment opportunities where they can begin to study things that matter in relation to the curriculum, that creates a sense of engagement that's very powerful. Policy context, mandated knowledges, and learner life worlds are all important. And that means that we're looking at the context of our policy, like we began with the AITSL standards, the mandated knowledges in relation to the learner life worlds. All of these have to be in interplay. We're not saying to veer off of the mandated curriculum or to veer away from policy, but to work within policy, within curriculum, and within the learner life worlds that students bring. A co-construction of curriculum, I think, is very important to allow for students to partake in the types of things that they read, the types of things that they engage with in classrooms, the types of material that they're introduced to, and that they bring to the classroom as well. And a pedagogy that's informed by funds of knowledge and ways of knowing. And what I mean by that is looking at what students bring to the classroom in terms of their lived life experiences, and use that as a catalyst to robust learning. I began with the question about, are there limits? And I'd like to answer that question. And I'm sure there's other answers to it as well. I said, are there limits to being religiously responsive? And I think there are. I think there's three. The first is, the limit is we're not proposing or expecting educators to be experts in all cultures and religions. That's not the point. The point is not to be an expert in every cultural tradition and every religious tradition of every diverse student that comes into our classroom. Rather, it's to begin to allow them to create the space to express themselves. The second is, yes, there's also a limit. We're not expected to teach for faith formation. I think a lot of times when we speak about things like religious responsivity, the misunderstanding is, so you're asking me to teach about faith? No, we're not teaching about faith as faith formation. We're allowing students to define themselves and to be supportive of their definition of their faith. And if that happens to be a practicing, observant definition of their faith, we're supportive of it. And if it's the opposite, then we're also supportive of that. And lastly, yes, there is a limit in that being religiously responsive cannot come at the expense of silencing another's beliefs or views. So it can't be that we're being religiously responsive, allowing a student to express their views, which happen to be discriminatory toward another group or another individual. So part of this being a conversation that is based in social justice and a just education is to ensure a safe space for all students. Three last implications. I think if there's three things that you leave with this talk, it's one, that I think that faith-centered epistemologies are valid ways of knowing. What I mean by that is the way that we understand the world through faith is a valid way of knowing the world. And we need to recognize that students will come to classrooms with faith-centered ways of knowing, and for them, that may be a valid way of knowing. I recall a conversation I had with a colleague years ago in a teacher education college, and I said, we were having a conversation, we didn't win something, it was like a grant that we didn't win. And she said, I can't believe we didn't win this research grant. And I said, it wasn't meant to be. And she said, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, I guess it just wasn't meant for us to win it. Maybe we'll try again. She said, I don't believe that. And I said, okay. And she goes, is that coming from your religious view? And I said, yeah. I said, I believe, from my religious perspective, that you put in your best foot forward, and then after, if you don't get it, you probably just wasn't meant for you. And that's just my worldview. And she said, I don't agree with that. And she brushed off and she walked away. I said, and that for me was a moment where I said, that's the way I look at the world. That's my worldview. That's the way I understand things. You don't have to agree with it, but that's the way I understand them. And the way you understand things are the way you understand them. But to create a space for the fact that students will come to classrooms with faith-centered ways of looking at the world. I had another student on another tangent who came in and said, I don't think this work is ready to be submitted. And I said, but it's due. And they said, but I don't think I've put in my best effort yet. And I said, but you had time. They said, well, in my belief system, they said, I believe that I shouldn't submit something until it's ready to be submitted, until it's perfect. And this actually was a student was being very sincere. They very strongly felt that they needed an extension. because they felt that they weren't able to put in their best foot forward. Again, it was a faith-centered worldview. It was a way that they looked at things, and we were able to negotiate a way that worked for them in that moment. The second thing is to acknowledge inter and intra-pluralism. And going back to the example of Cat Stevens, use of Islam, to recognize that there is inter-pluralism between Muslim communities and across communities. So I think it's very important to recognize that there is this pluralism that exists, and again, to not make assumptions about the learners in our classrooms. And lastly, again, to anticipate fluidity of learner values. That you will have students that go home for the summer and they come back less or more, however you define that, religious. And that's very valid. I mean, with any student you have, their values are shifting constantly. For us as adults, it's the same thing, right? The way I was a couple years ago is probably not the same way I am now. And we're evolving in the way we think and the values that we hold dear to us, what we see as being our primary or central values, and those are shifting. So part of being supportive of our learners is to acknowledge the fact that there's going to be a fluidity of their values. I'd like to stop there. Thank you, and I'll open up for questions.
Do we need a mic? Oh, just see how loud people are.
I wanted to ask a question related to, you know how you had a few slides back, you had the thing about when you had one of the quotes that you had about one of the students saying that, you know, they didn't know how to challenge the teacher that they respected. So they had a teacher they respected, they didn't know how to challenge them when it came to some of the stereotypical kind of ideas that come through. How would you help, and or what would be, I guess, a response towards educators on how to provide a space where it is safe for them to do that, while at the same time respecting the teacher?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I think it comes from us as educators, the responsibility we as educators have, which is to create that safe space. And part of creating that safe space is to acknowledge the fact that I, as an educator, have my own values and views. I'm not going to shy away from sharing them because it is who I am. But at the same time, I'm not expecting you to believe or to align with my values or views. So if I didn't share who I am or the values that I have, I think that would be a disservice to the students. But if I share them in a way where I'm imposing those, then that's also a disservice to the students. So a lot of the conversation that I had when I was teaching in schools was, I'm going to, from time to time, share my views on different perspectives. If you ask me, I'll share what I think. And at the same time, I expect you to challenge them. And I expect you to feel comfortable in challenging them. And I would say this at the beginning of the course, and then also throughout any of the teaching, I would emphasize the fact that if I felt like there was something controversial, I will share what I believe, but you should know that even my beliefs, my values, my perspectives can change. And you, as a student in the classroom, might be able to actually change them for me. So I expect you to be part of this engagement and conversation. But again, that's an ethic I think that we as educators need to begin to embody. And I'm not saying that I necessarily embody them well, but it's something that I try to do. And I think we as educators need to be able to do that, where we say, we create that space for them to challenge each other and us as educators.
Can we use this for the purpose of live streaming?
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nadeem. I just wanted
Is it
to.
on?
Is it
Sorry.
okay?
Yeah, just.
Yes, I just wanted to discuss two things here. You talked about the super diversity of Muslim learners, and I think there is one point that I think you could think of is in your categories, your four categories. Where do you put the secular Muslims? I think you mentioned that afterwards, because as you said, there are 2-3 generations here. They tend to become probably more secular. Or again, if you look at the migration patterns, it varies. Let's say if you're coming from the Middle East, you're coming from North Africa, you're coming from Sub-Saharan Africa, or Asia, you don't have the same interpretation or perspective about being Muslim. Given, you know, let's say if you're coming from North Africa, Tunisia, or Morocco, it's quite different. You're coming from Sub-Saharan Africa, etc., etc. So it's very complex. So there are two things here I would like you to know, to talk about. is the idea of universality. For example, in France, we talk a lot about that, the concept of universality. What all the Muslims across the world share. For example, their values, their worldview that share. So I think in this pedagogy, it's important to have that in mind. And the other thing is it's very strong in linguistics, what we call a little bit the third space, where it's not about your religion, it's not about my religion, it's not about your culture, but it's a place where it is neutral and everybody shares, rather than, because I think we live in a context of tension. You talk about Islamophobia, you talk about secular, I mean, my perspective is that secular perspective. Let's say the context, if you look at Australia or Canada or France, these are very secular in nature. Now, how do you avoid that tension in a classroom? Instead of focusing on the responsiveness, I would think of the concept of third space or safe or the neutral space. What do you think of those points?
The points about universality and third space, I mean, I'm not overly familiar with third space, so I won't comment on it. The point about universality, I think some people may challenge as well, because they may not see, there may not be universal beliefs across all different denominations and sects. Or what I mean by that is there may be certain theological positions that some sects want to have highlighted that others may not. So it'll be difficult to have a universality that is fully inclusive. I'd have to think about it some more. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking it might be difficult, but I think it's a good point to raise for consideration.
Thank you for your talk. It's found it both profound and confronting. In terms of the super diversity, I'm thinking back to the AITSL standards, and one of them says, know children and how they learn. But in a way, it's very difficult to know children because they are so diverse. And we, according to the thesis you've been sharing with us, it's very easy to make, for us as teachers, to make assumptions about the children in front of us, which could actually be detrimental to their learning. So, in some settings, there's opportunity for teachers to get to know their learners deeply. But in other settings, particularly, I'm thinking about secondary schools where teachers might only see a class for 1 hour a week. And it's very difficult then to get to know them as individuals and all of the different constructs which you've presented to us. So how can you give us some light at the end of the tunnel? Because this is a very difficult journey for teachers. If teachers want to take your thesis seriously and deal with those children as individual characters, then it's problematic for us. So how do we move forward?
Yeah, I think it's a good question in terms of the challenge that we as educators feel. I myself, as an educator in the classroom, I might understand Muslim diversity, but that doesn't mean I understand diversity of every other diversity. So it is a challenge. And I think the point about assumptions is also very important. We will make assumptions. We always make assumptions. We can't avoid assumptions. But what I think we can do is challenge our assumptions. So if we made an assumption, to begin to question the types of assumptions we've made in our own mind about students, and through conversations with students, begin to understand where we might stand, or where they might stand on that. In terms of where do we go from here, I think in inclusive education, in equity practice, there's more and more approaches to teaching and learning that are coming out that allow us to get into the life world of the students. And I think those practices that we've seen, those approaches that are still growing in terms of how do we get into their life worlds, a lot of icebreaker type of activities, a lot of assignments that allow for students' voice to come in, a lot of opportunities for students to share their perspectives. Those types of approaches, I think that if they're done consistently and strategically in our teaching, at the outset of a course, whether you see your students, like you said, in secondary, an hour a week, I think there's ways to create opportunities for students to share who they are. And like I mentioned, they likely would not share the complexities that we just shared here. Right? I mean, each student would emphasize different aspects of their identity. And however that is, that's what we use as the funds of knowledge in our classroom and our teaching. So I hope this wasn't overly overwhelming. I think this is more for us as educators to acknowledge the fact that there are these diversities, and these diversities lead to complexities, and then both these diversities and complexities can be applied to any community out there. But the task for us as educators is to create that space for learners to be able to express themselves multiple times throughout a course, in ways that are authentic, not just in terms of sharing who they are and then not connecting it to curriculum. I think it's very important that whatever they share is then connected to curriculum, it's connected to the discussions and the instruction, it's also then connected to the assessment pieces. And it weaves itself through all of those. It takes a fair amount of thinking initially, but after that, I think it grows on us.
Just a question. With, say, teacher training, professional developments and the like, if they were to be educated on Islam and Muslim diversity and all of that stuff, invariably there'd be a sort of a universal cultural exposure to things that Muslims do and things that are acceptable and so on. So in a way, we are sort of essentializing in training the teachers, and we're asking them not to essentialize when they deal with the students. So if you can just elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah. I think invariably there's going to be a level of essentializing, as you mentioned. But then it's to acknowledge the fact that we're essentializing and to acknowledge which angle we're coming from. If I was to tell you what Muslims believe, I'd probably be giving you my interpretation, understanding from the people that I've studied with and have been influenced by of their Islam. But that would easily silence many other people out there who also see themselves as Muslim. So I think if I'm going to come from a particular perspective, I need to be able to say, this is a Sunni perspective, or this is a Shia perspective, or an Ismaili perspective. But for me to say all Muslims believe in these things would likely be inaccurate to all Muslims. So I think so yes, we will essentialize at times, and when we essentialize, I think it's important for us to explain where we're coming from.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Nadeem. Very interesting talk, and one that could be repeated a few times just to make sure you've had the opportunity to really digest and think about it. I've been thinking a bit about this idea of super diversity, and I get that at one level, but there's another level at which I don't, and that is because I've actually never met a homogeneous class. And I've taught children who are supposedly all come from sort of a Anglo-Australian or whatever background at times, and I never found them to be homogeneous because there were variations in the way they looked, the way they saw the world, their gender, their gender identity, their beliefs, their actions, their strengths, their home economic situation, culturally. And so part of me is thinking, well, there's got to be something there about how we operate as teachers, and that's not about saying everybody is an individual, so I'm going to relate to each of them. We've got to somehow create a community of people in classrooms, in early year settings, where everyone has got a place and is valued and respected, and we've got to have a voice, but at the same time, we're going to be together. So we've got an identity as a group. And I think that's, you know, a really important thing about teaching.
Mm.
You know, how do we belong in this context together, even though we have this, well, diversity at one level and super at another? Yeah, so I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're very right that you still want to have a sense of community in the classroom, but that sense of community has to be co-constructed. Students need to be able to play that part in developing what that community identity is. And I mean, for us as educators, we would know that if you had a classroom this year, your classroom next year will also have its own identity. Right? It won't. I mean, it could be the same school, same context, but the types of students, the aspects or the life worlds that they bring to the classroom will shape what the identity of that classroom will be. So I guess what I'm saying is, yes, all classrooms are heterogeneous, and yes, we want to create that sense of community, but we want to do it with the students in that classroom. And by creating that space for them to share, find commonalities within that shared space, that particular context, allowing them to define what that sense of community looks like.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Any other questions?
I think we're out of time.
We've got a few more minutes, so
Okay.
unless
Thoroughly enjoyed your talk as well. Thank you very much. One of my concerns, having gone from the private independent sector back into working for the department, is not being able to openly discuss faith with students. I work in a school, we have quite a diverse range of students from different faiths, including Islam, and it can be quite challenging to want to inform students about different aspects, as far as my knowledge allows me to, without the fear that it will be misinterpreted by me, by parents in particular, or that by empowering the students with knowledge about a particular faith, let's say it's related to the subject, the topic at the time, that won't go home to somebody in a different family from a different faith. It's quite challenging, whereas having worked in a religious school that was very open to discussing other faiths, that didn't seem to happen. So I don't know how we get around that as a public system that doesn't have religious education as a subject in this state.
Are you suggesting that, or are you saying that the challenge is that you're not able to discuss faith, or students are not able to raise?
I think the students too are sometimes uncomfortable discussing their faith values, whether they be Christian, Islam, agnostic, atheist. You know, they.
Is that something mandated by the school? Is that something that's
No. I think it's a cultural thing, and I just know that there are even staff who, you know, it's awkward if students ask you about your faith, because you don't want it to go home as you're being trying to repress your belief systems.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's a secondary school, and so
Yeah.
students are very curious and they will ask questions. But we're in an environment where, you know, students don't actually know what some of the celebrations are around the world at all. You know.
Yeah, I think that cultural sort of avoidance of speaking about faith and about religion, one comes out of a fear of, like you mentioned, that we're teaching faith formation, we're going to influence the beliefs and values of other students. And others say, well, this is a secular space, we're in a public or independent school, that's a secular space, and we shouldn't bring religion into it. I think the position that we're taking from an equity, inclusive education perspective is to say that if, however a student defines themselves, is who they are, and to be inclusive of who they are means that we're not teaching them about their faith, we're not teaching about any faith, we're allowing students to define themselves, and they're bringing it to the classroom. But by silencing their values or their beliefs or their perspectives is taking a part away from them. It's silencing a part of who they are, what they may see as being important to who they are. And I think that doesn't lead to the robust sense of equity and inclusive education and responsivity that we're talking about. So I think it's about reinforcing in creating that space, but also reinforcing for the educators in that environment that we're not teaching faith, but we're allowing student identities to come to the fore.
Yeah. I just think that if we don't allow these students or openly invite them to express themselves, we keep the stereotypes, incorrect stereotypes alive.
Well, we create stereotypes, I think, in one part of it. The other part of it is disengagement. I think anytime you silence an aspect of a student's identity, you have disengagement in classrooms over time, right? Because students don't see themselves in the curriculum, they don't see themselves in the conversation, they don't feel like they can actually express their views, so they start to tippy-toe over what they're saying and not saying and how they say it and what they say. So for it to be a truly inclusive space, it needs to be able to be safe and open.
So mine isn't a question, it's just a comment. I'm in the fortunate position of being an EALD teacher. So I deal with children from different cultures. And because they're smaller groups so we take the groups out, so there'll be about 4 or 5 students per group. I do find that they are far more able to discuss their religion. And even some of the tasks that have been set by some of the teachers, like one was about the Black Death for hats. And it was, what has the rise of Islam contributed to the Black Death? And it was looking how that, so they had different topics, and all the Muslim boys chose that, so they could dive into it and actually explore it. And that brought up some really rich conversations about faith, and they would say to me, "You're a Christian, Mrs. Rowley, so what do you think about this?" And I'd go, "Oh, that's different," and we have these wonderful discussions where we learn about the different faiths. And they were also saying about when you're talking about how people in Australia view Muslims, they had opened up a new building, and they said they invited the local community to come and have a look. He said, because people are usually scared. And it was so interesting to hear that that's how they perceived things. So I think, like Donna says, it's important for us teachers. We're not teaching religion, we are being who we are, and we're inviting a space for those students to feel comfortable to express their religion. So it's wonderful to see something like this, where we are bringing that knowledge, that we're not teaching about faith, we are just having that space where we feel comfortable discussing it. So thank you for your contribution.
Thank you. And just on that note, we should end. I think it's 7 o'clock. Thank you for attending, and hopefully the conversation has been beneficial. And have a good evening.